Okay, Brendan is back, and should we wait a couple more minutes, or we should make a start? I'm not sure whether more people will come, or we should start. We should, right? Okay, all right. So before we start today's important seminar, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we have met today, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. And also for those of you joining us online, the presentation will be recorded, and it will be made available on our website, so you can have access to it anytime that you want to have a listen to it. But for today, we are very privileged to have in our midst Dr. Brendan Marc Finn from the University of Michigan. He founded the Informal Sustainability Lab, which he also leads at the School of Environment and Sustainability. His ambitious mixed methods research seeks to drive a transformation in human geographic scholarship by demonstrating that informal processes are primary force shaping global urbanization. Drawing on extensive fieldwork in Ghana and the Democratic Republic of Congo, his project explores the informal paradox of electronic waste recycling in Accra, which happens to be the capital city of Ghana, to illustrate how urbanization, housing, and livelihood survival interact with and are impacted by broader processes of economic, social, and environmental transformation. Finn's scholarship links urban spaces to resource extraction frontiers, revealing how global mineral supply chains are dialectically interlinked with and structurally anchored by the foundational labor and spatial configurations of informal populations. He has published extensively on the issue of urban informality, and also critical resource extraction, mostly in Africa. And he's also a research scientist within the School of Environment and Sustainability. I also happen to have worked with him. He's a very close friend of mine. We've worked on multiple projects, from climate change to urban informality, and recently to how do you call it, electronic waste processes in African cities. So Brendan, we are very much privileged to have you here, and we hope that you will engage with us. So basically, we hope that you speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and we use the remaining minutes for Q&A session. So over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Patrick, for that generous introduction, and thank you so much to the Informal Urbanism Research Hub for inviting me. I'm really honored and happy to be here, and so let me dive in. Hopefully, I can keep it to 35 minutes, but always feel free to kind of tell me to hurry up. So the title of the talk is Informal Infrastructuring at the Heart of Sustainable Development, and the aim of the talk kind of draws on a lot of recent work that I've been putting out by myself, as well as with important collaborators. And in some parts, the work is theoretical, trying to understand informality in new ways that kind of honor its complexity without romanticizing it, but also trying to understand, what it offers to people and why it exists as a prominent force around the world. And on the other hand, there's a critical challenge, I think, to sustainability scholarship and sustainable development scholarship to actually take informality seriously, right? I'm located at the School for Environment and Sustainability. And when I tell people that I do research on informality, I think they think it's perhaps a peripheral thing around the world. And so in creating the Informal Sustainability Lab, I'm kind of mounting a challenge to sustainability scholarship, whether that's within geography or planning or more broadly, not only to take informality seriously, but to ask as a scholar, how do we make informality sustainable long term? So this talk is going to draw on the informal infrastructuring as the theoretical framing that I mentioned. And it's also going to then get into some debates within geography, and then draw specifically on two case studies, that of Agbogloshi, one of the world's largest e-waste processing sites, which is also home to twin informal settlements, Agbogloshi and Old Fadama, where I do quite a lot of work. And then also the start of mineral supply chains around artisanal and small-scale mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what I'm going to try to do is to link those two cases through the theory that we have here, and essentially bring together, as Patrick mentioned, critical engagements with urban geography as well as resource geography, right? So to try and look at how supply chains spatialize in places, but also how places and cities are linked dialectically and relationally to those production areas too. So it's a big claim in the informal infrastructuring paper. This is something that Dr. Elman Banduako, a brilliant assistant professor at University of Alberta, and I recently published in Progress in Human Geography. The paper is titled Informal Infrastructuring, the Defining Feature of 21st Century Global Urbanization. Right? We wrote the paper to try to disrupt this notion around informality being peripheral, right? Because we currently view informality as a localized, site-specific issue, confined to the margins of cities. In our reading, this fails to capture how global capitalism, how broader structuring processes, including the green transition, which I'm interested in, decarbonization too, operate and rely on and create informality over the long term. So informality in our reading is not peripheral. It's a planetary scale process. And I think this is a quote taken from the abstract of the paper, which sums up a lot of the argument. To imagine informality as peripheral is to mistake marginalization with marginality. So let me just spend a second on that, right? A lot of populations and informal actors are deeply marginalized. They're marginalized by the state. They're marginalized through economic inequality, right? This is, for me, a kind of a watertight argument. However, this reality and this process is not marginal to our everyday lives, right? It's not marginal to the production of global economic and environmental and political transformation. And if we want to take seriously the defining feature of the 21st century being informality, right? Let's look at some of the numbers. And so the International Labour Organization estimates that 61% of the world's workforce works informally, right? That's informal work that is not formally registered, regulated, or protected by the state. The United Nations estimates that by 2050, 3 billion people may be living in informal settlements around the world, predominantly with this demographic change taking place in Africa and Asia. If that number is correct, that's almost half of the total urban population in 2050, right? And I link this to different modes of labor production, including artisanal and small-scale mining, which includes 45 million people. It's the leading non-farm source of rural work around the world. And it's the bedrock upon which a lot of cities and urban transformation is reliant upon. We need the materials that come from artisanal and small-scale mining. And you can make this kind of argument for a lot of different things. And when we talk about it being a planetary process, we're trying to take a lot of what we've learned from critical urban geography on informality and bring it to what people call the global north. I'm a little bit skeptical of divisions between global north and south as kind of theoretical anchors, but let's just use it now as shorthand, right? To look not only at how informality and informal labor underpins so much of everyday life for everyone, whether we live in informal settlements or informal areas or not, but also how informality is a continuously shaping force in the global north too, whether that's through zero-hour contracts or the gig economy, or whether that's through growing RV encampments near major tech companies that are requiring casualized labor. So the paper on the left is informal infrastructure, and the paper on the right is informality at the heart of sustainable development. So first I need to make the case on why informality matters and what it does, right? So in the paper, Informal Infrastructuring, we introduce a conceptual framework around the 4 Ps, what we call the four Ps. right? So people, place, process, and politics. So we specifically use the term infrastructuring as an active verb to capture the generative, ongoing practices of building, plotting, and connecting the city, to borrow some of the terminology from assemblage urban theory. Let me break down these four quadrants, right? People shifts our focus to the recursive material reality of infrastructural labor. People are not just passive victims of exclusion, although they face extreme marginalization, but they act as the connective tissue of urban world making. When formal institutions fail or purposefully marginalize or dispossess or evict informal populations, marginalized residents mobilize dense social networks and reciprocal labor, trust, and the negotiation of these relationships to physically build the systems of their everyday lives. Second, we move to place, right, which foregrounds the multi-scalar spatial manifestations of this labor and urban process more broadly. It moves from a local place-based responses, such as self-built informal settlements and dynamic urban morphologies, which we often associate with places and informality. And it grounds it in a planetary geography, showing how residents actively repurpose materials and remake spatial environments through and because of informality. Third, we move into more heterodox ground when it comes to geography and informality. We zoom way out to the process of informality, which highlights how it acts as an essential global input to our everyday economy. It connects cities to distal hinterlands, borrowing on the language from planetary urbanization, Neil Brenner and Christian Schmidt, and sustains the metabolism of planetary urbanization itself, something that those scholars, borrowing a lot from political economy, do not necessarily engage with, right? Informality is really central to these processes because of the people and the places that are underpinning them. And so we need to take informality seriously, and to understand it in this kind of multi-scalar way, we need to link it then to the metabolism of planetary urbanization itself. So massive extended operations, whether it's informal or artisanal mining, or e-waste processing, demonstrate the incremental and adaptive and, of course, relational nature of the infrastructural production that occurs on a planetary scale. Now, finally, politics situates these practices within broader struggles and collective action. I think, along with Elman, that this is an unrealized component of informality, that there's a very generative political life associated with informality when we do zoom out and realize the scale and scope of informality around the world, that there are 61% of the global workforce that are working without these kind of formal contracts, right? If we treat them as discrete kind of units, I think we lose a lot of that political power, which is built through organizations such as Slum Dwellers International and WeGo, which fight for resources and recognition as well as rights across borders. So to us, these 4 Ps show that informality is a dialectical mode of survival and planetary urbanization. Now, why did we develop informal infrastructuring as a term? I think it's principally done to act as a methodological bridge, right? I was initially trained at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, which is very attentive and concerned with place-based understandings of the city, of informality, how to kind of work with informality at the very small neighborhood scale. And I'm indebted to this approach to urban scholarship. I then moved under the tutelage of Neil Brenner to understand planetary urbanization, right? You can start to see how these things are informing my work. And so the informal infrastructure can serve as a bridge, at least I think so, between planetary urbanization and post-colonial urban studies, which often kind of pose themselves as mutually exclusive or not necessarily inhabiting the same kinds of theoretical spaces. And I think we can add another layer to this on assemblage theory, which is very popular when it comes to informal scholarship more broadly, and political economy, not to understand these necessarily as mutually exclusive, but hopefully as informing one another, both theoretically and in an applied sense. And if we go further back in my career, go to a a piece I published in 2023 on the structure of informality. This was a piece I wrote for Dialogues in Human Geography, which looked at how we could historicize the concept of informality beyond the valuable and brilliant work of Keith Hart in the early 70s, who came up with the term the informal sector along with the International Labour Organization. And however we may critique that term, gave a long history that we've inherited on informal scholarship. What I tried to do in the structure of informality piece was look at how early urbanization and colonial control of Zambia, what is now called Zambia, within Northern Rhodesia, created through urban production of their nascent cities, created different labor and spatial regimes along different types of dwellings that were deemed desirable or undesirable, different modes of labor that were deemed acceptable or unacceptable. Even though these were not called informal, they were mutually co-constitutive. The British colonial government purposefully brought in Zambian labor for the copper mines as a magnet for urbanization, and then either brought on that labor into the specific mines, or when that labor was not necessarily useful, kept it literally at a buffer distance away from the European enclaves of the colonial city. So for me, scale is a really important component of informality. And for me, scale is not just spatial, right? I've mentioned planetary urbanization numerous times. It's also temporal. How things over time create inequalities in the present, or maybe challenge inequalities in the present. And on a spatial lens, how an act of consumption somewhere, say in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I'm talking to you from today, is necessarily an act of production elsewhere. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit more as I talk about the e-waste and ASM, artisanal mining case studies. And then, I also have a critique of broader kind of Marxist accounting of informality, right? Which often renders it kind of part of the reserve army of labor, right? If I go back to my early training at University of Cape Town, it's to take the issue of agency seriously. It's to take the contradictions and complexities of informality very, very seriously. And for me, I understand this in a provisional kind of sense, right? People enact certain types of agency that they have in pursuit of upward mobility to support their family, in pursuit of a livelihood. But that agency, I understand, as necessarily constrained by those structuring forces across that multi-scalar imaginary that I've outlined. Now, if we want to draw this forward a little bit more, this is a photo of Agbogloshi, the informal settlement, directly next to where the active e-waste processing is taking place. And if we apply an assemblage lens to this, let's look at it and see the generative and fantastic components that assemblage theory can render methodologically powerful for us here. So you can see the drainage trench carved in the dirt, the overhead electricity lines that are crisscrossing the sky, the satellite dish hooked up to a self-built structure of corrugated iron and repurposed wood. It shows this relationship between people and non-human actors, right? However, I think if we zoom out of this picture, we get also a much broader kind of imaginary that we need to understand. If we zoom out of the picture, we would see the massive e-waste site. We would see the polluted Korle Lagoon, which I'll show shortly through a map. But then we can do that even further, right? We can ask the question of why e-waste processing has boomed in Ghana and Accra over the last 20 years, why Ghana receives 15% of the world's e-waste, and why it is managed and processed and repurposed in an informal way. We can look at the flows of electronic goods, which are mislabeled as charitable donations or used or usable electronics coming from the EU, other African countries, which then essentially get dumped in Ghana to deal with through informal means. And I think we need to draw on that central question of why this broader scale, whether it's the neighborhood, the city, the transnational flows of goods, or whether it is, the increased demand for e-waste, which acts for minerals, which acts as a magnet for the communities that are mostly that have mostly migrated to Agbogbloshie from northern Ghana or other surrounding African countries, who are pursuing upward mobility and livelihood creation through the e-waste industry, which has been associated with tremendous urbanization. So if we then extend the question why, I think we can draw on Andrew Sayers' idea of rational abstractions, right? Rational abstractions understand that there are many of these different types of relational processes that are constantly unfolding, but it asks us to isolate some of these driving forces, right? I spoke about the structure of informality. And when I'm talking about the different e-waste flows and global demand for minerals, and even the circular economy, which is embedded within the e-waste industry in Agbogbloshie, Accra, we start to get at these abstract, these rational abstractions, which are these driving forces, right? For me, supply chains, global demand, even resource demand more generally helps us explain this. So linking then critical minerals to the spatialization of e-waste management. And then I think there's also someone that I want to draw on just very briefly, just to keep time short, and that is on Michael Burroway's extended case method, right? He speaks about the macro foundations of micro processes. That is not to eschew the essential and important local scale, the micro practices that are deeply embedded in informal settlements and informal activities, as well as informal actors, but it's trying to look up vertically at how those are structured. Right? When we extend our case vertically, we come to understand this localized image that I present to you here is actually the last node of a planetary supply chain before it recirculates back into global mineral supply chains. The people living in precarity here have migrated in response to agricultural decline and conflict, and the materials that are being recycled are directly linked to this global demand. And then we can kind of zoom out even further. Beyond these trucks is the active burning that's taking place in Agbogbloshie. Now, to recycle the materials such as copper, aluminium, and lead, open burning is a tremendously large problem when it comes to Agbogbloshie. And so this becomes a problem not only for the community that's living there, the 100,000 people in the informal settlements, but also the whole city, which is exposed to tremendously high levels of PM 2.5. So in this piece, published with Patrick Carbonell and Dimitris Gunnaridis in NPJ Urban Sustainability, we take seriously these scales, right? I conducted 55 interviews in Agbogbloshie and came up with this hypothesis around the informal paradox. It's that people are pursuing economic livelihood opportunities and upward mobility, but it's coming at a tremendous long-term cost. It's coming at the cost of social and environmental well-being over the long term. However, to take seriously the actions on the local scale and to treat the informal workers with the respect and dignity they deserve, we have to ask why that trade-off is being made. And in my mind, it's a rational trade-off to be made when you are faced with extreme constraints. You are exercising provisional agency in the face of those extreme constraints, and yet you are pathologized for doing so, targeted as dirty or unwanted or informal, undesirable, without understanding the structural underpinnings of why that paradox takes place in the first place. So for me, informality is so generative because it is necessarily so challenging. It's the micro scale, but it's also the macro foundations of that. It's how the micro scale informs the macro, but also how the macro structures in the first place, coming back to my idea of the dialectic. So then we did the 55 interviews, and then Patrick and I worked with Dimitris Gunnaridis to ask how we can render this, or whether we could render this in a geospatial sense, in a quantitative sense. So Dr. Gunnaridis then extracted 200,000 buildings and divided these 200,000 buildings in 4 different zones, concentric zones around Agbogbloshie. So he measured then the relationship between urbanization, right, the drive of e-waste processing and economic activity as proxied by urbanization, and then looked at 20 years of satellite imagery of PM 2.5, this being a proxy for exposure to toxicity. And what we found was in the top left panel, what started out in 2000 as a negative relationship between urbanization and exposure to pollution became an extremely positive relationship in 2015 and 2020. We have then quantitative evidence for the informed qualitative approach that we have around this paradox in particular. People are accessing the economic opportunities and they're being exposed to increased level of toxicity in exchange for that. So for me, informality is not just the livelihood opportunity, not just the housing, right? It's a fundamental insight, not only into human nature, but it's a fundamental insight into social spatial transformation, especially when we broaden out the scales and we look at things through the methodological bridge that is informal infrastructuring. The image of the left is taken from a recreational area. This was shared with me from the Accra Metropolitan Assembly, which shows the waterways in 1970 versus now. And you see how e-waste activities and urbanization have reclaimed the water areas, how they've changed the flow of the lagoon itself through these human-based activities. And this is the piece on the structure of informality, which is acting as a segue where we're going to now move to the first mile. So if agbogloshi and e-waste was the last mile or the terminal node of the circular economy, if we want to understand it as a circular economy, then mining for me is the very start of this. And so I've spoken a little bit about Zambia, urbanization, and mining. But this work, which was initially written in 2023, then took me to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which produces about 3/4 of the world's total mined output for cobalt. Now, cobalt is a material in lithium-ion batteries. It's the thing that keeps electric cars stable in terms of temperature and gives them its range, right? It's any one of multiple different minerals we could use to make this kind of example. The reason I picked it was because of its concentration in one place, in the south of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Quite a challenging place to do research, but I think almost ground zero for global geopolitics. And it really bore out my argument around the informal-formal dialectic, the structure of informality. Around the world, as I mentioned, you have 45 million people that work actively as artisanal and small-scale miners or informal workers that are extracting these minerals for global supply, right? And it gets packaged and then processed and shipped around the world, mainly for refinement in China. And the dialectic presents itself very, very firmly to me in the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Informal workers find active deposits. They are then almost treated as spotters by industrial mining companies and who then deploy the state to use the army to evict artisanal or informal miners from those areas in order to establish concessions on areas that are now known as active, good areas for cobalt and copper ore. This forms part of the relational and dialectical relationship that I keep getting at. But I think the story is much broader. Not only is copper, from the Democratic Republic of Congo enabling electricity, just like it did for the telegraph in the early 20th century. Indeed, the concessions from the early 20th century, which were owned by King Leopold II, were the very same concessions where uranium was taken for the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in the Second World War. So there's a continuity of extraction and indeed of artisanal mining over 130 years. But I think it's also a broader urban story specifically. So for me, I mentioned urbanization, or the urban is a fluid understanding around a process, right? It's not just the city. It's the relationship between the hinterland and the city itself. It's what links it. But cobalt and copper mining in Kolwezi, as this photo shows, is literally acting as a magnet for demographic urbanization to industrial and artisanal mines. And then you have the literal mining under the ground of the city itself. So we have urbanization and mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo here, but we also have it linked through the process of informality more broadly, wherein informality is central to the labor and the outputs that we all rely on, but it's also reshaping the cities where the mining is taking place too. And this image taken from Amnesty International's recent report around forced evictions and sexual violence associated with cobalt and copper mining in Democratic Republic of Congo bears this out in kind of frightening detail to me. So then in my work, I looked at this idea that, you know, we have a lot of really critical generative work in geography around informality. This does not exist so much when it comes to critical resource geography, right? The general argument on informality and mining is to formalize mining. They don't necessarily ask why informality exists in the first place and what purposes it serves, however constrained those purposes may be, however marginalized people may be because of informality. We have child labor, we have sexual violence, right? We have people that are exposing themselves to extreme occupational safety risks to get the resources that we all rely on. But if we come back to the earlier paper on informal paradox, you start to understand the reasons why someone may descend into a 40-meter unfortified corridor or tunnel in order to extract this cobalt. It becomes a rational choice, although it is a constrained and deeply troubling and challenging one. So this piece on transformative cohabitation then uses this critical scholarship on informality to challenge the formalization orthodoxy. Because if we think about informality more broadly, right, I think there's probably two poles when it comes to intervention. If we want to take sustainable development seriously as it relates to informality, we have to think about intervention. We have to think about governance. Now, most of the governance, I think, can be characterized in two broad poles. One is laissez-faire kinds of hands-off approaches to intervention, right? It's almost like a bootstrapped idea that people can get themselves out of the poverty that they had no hand in making themselves. And on the other hand, I think formalization, which is some kind of intervention, but I don't think it's an appropriate one because it often raises the barriers to entry, whether that's in informal settlements through zoning laws or certain minimum building standards, or that's through mining, through necessarily belonging to certain cooperatives and standards, which people can't afford to be able to do in the first place, pulls people out of the livelihood generating opportunities that they may have. So some kind of governance middle ground needs to exist, which understands that integrity of informality in the first place, the rational, albeit complex and contradictory reasons that it exists, but also looks at the structural formation of it itself, right? It starts to look at the industrial miners that are displacing whole communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It starts to look at the Accra Metropolitan Assembly's history of eviction of the e-waste communities, which essentially bulldoze informal settlements and the e-waste activities without giving anyone any alternative options or any pathway to actually pursue upward mobility. It's the geographical fix, right? So it just moves the problem elsewhere. And people try to understand or engage with informality by saying formalize it without looking at these spatial and temporal scales which produce it in the first place. The informal-formal dialectic, to me, is not just a theoretical notion. I think it helps to inform what I think is an important governance intervention. So for the mining, I talk about transformative cohabitation, right? That's bringing together the informal and the formal into kind of binding relationships where they owe certain things to each other in relationship to minimum standards, transparent feed. But we can also think about this through the urban geographical lens, right? We can think about what Elmond and I write about in terms of supported self-provisioning. This is the fundamental notion that in informal settlements around the world and through informal labor will be much better off served by working with rather than against informality. Now, if you think about sustainable development, the Brundtland Commission's 1987 orthodox kind of understanding and definition of it, meeting the needs of the present without compromising those of the future. We normally understand sustainable development through the economy, through the environment, and through a social lens. If we take seriously the social lens, we have never been sustainable, right? We've never met the needs of the present. And if we want to actually meet the needs of the present, we need to take informality seriously through these different types of interventions. That starts and necessarily begins with understanding not only the scale and scope of informality, but the contradictions inherent within it. That it's both livelihood opportunity and marginalization at the same time. That it's both the pursuit of mobility in an upward direction and the exposure of oneself and one's community, oftentimes, to extreme levels of toxicity. In some ways, this is a departure from previous scholarship on informality, which I'm sure we've all read many of these kinds of papers, which says it's not a binary, right? You know, that's a fair point. That's one I've made myself. But the dialectic, I think, goes one step further. Not only is it not a binary, it's mutually co-constitutive. They create and rely on one another over time. So Patrick and I have done some work on guided urbanization along with Gideon Azunre, where we look at informal settlements and try to apply this kind of middle ground intervention approach. So I think we can take informal infrastructure or these kind of new imaginaries of informality to look at three discrete kind of different approaches to scholarship. On the one hand, we have the kind of disruptive theoretical scholarship, right? We need new ways to understand informality, and we need new ways to understand its relationship to sustainable development. On the other hand, we have the applied or the empirical components, where we say it's really challenging, but absolutely essential to produce multifaceted, multi-scalar scholarship on informality that takes the micro scale seriously on its own terms, without necessarily putting it into contradiction with broader neighborhood, city, national, or global kind of processes. I think these things are working together. And I think if we bring together planetary and post-colonial urban studies, we'll be much better off for understanding informality over the long term. We can then draw together this industrial mine, this photo I took of a copper cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I got this small piece of cobalt given to me and brought back home. We can link this not only to the active processing of artisanal mining. Here you see mostly women who wash and process minerals before they are then taken for further refinement and then shipped across mainly to China to inform the global supply chains upon which we all rely, but also the buying houses, which then structure who gets paid what are the transparency mechanisms for active dispossession of people. And then we can link it to agbogloshi and e-waste, where you see the photos of the copper, right, in these bags that are essentially mined above ground, which are absolutely related to the proliferation of informal settlement expansion in Accra, because they offer people an economic opportunity. You see the lithium-ion batteries from cell phones, which contain the self-same cobalt that I'm looking at, but only at the end of the supply chain. And public health scholarship has done work in agbogloshi, in the informal settlement more broadly, not only with e-waste scholars, which found elevated levels of cobalt in breast milk, in people's blood and urine, in the soil of agbogloshi and Old Fadama, in the water of the Korle Lagoon. Now, Ghana does not have notable deposits of cobalt. This and other heavy metals literally makes its way through the supply chain, but has so many different types of ways that we can understand it, right? To me, informality is a window into further understanding that, to understanding marginalization, but also to understand how informality is actively reshaping 21st century urbanization. And that's the reason that we came up with the paper, Informal Infrastructure, to try bridge this in a broader sense. Now, we also have in the informal paradox piece a critique of the circular economy. I have no problem with the principle of the circular economy, but it also asks the question of it not necessarily being inherently just because it is circular, right? And the reason that it's not inherently just is because it has all these different types of inequality and marginalization associated with these supply chains. We can look at all different types of nodes through the supply chains, but my focus has been on the DRC and Ghana. Not only does informality underpin these debates, but I think it brings together these separate cases. I think it helps bring together also a broader critique of our moral geographies, right? I think it's a lot easier to dump e-waste in Ghana when we are spatially and geographically separated from it, because it's not necessarily my problem to deal with in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I hope over my scholarship, and I'm always invite collaboration, whether that's theoretical and empirical, to try to open up new methodological and normative ways forward, to understand informality in this processual and dialectical way, to take seriously the case study in relationship to the macro foundations that I think are absolutely essential too. So informality is produced over time and across space, and for me that helps show why a multiscalar imaginary is a prerequisite for understanding it properly. So in conclusion, I broadly argue that we need to rethink both informality and sustainability, and this fundamentally questions the notion of development if we are to take informality seriously. I think we need to use these theoretical and empirical devices and approaches to rethink governance models as well, and to tie the social arm of sustainable development to informality specifically, without kind of abandoning the generative components of informality, the social connective tissue that we highlight in the P for people, right? There's so much life and vitality and dynamism associated with informality. We cannot consign informal actors and people only to the reserve army of labor of the global economy. It's so much more complicated than that. It's so much more kind of arresting to us when we understand all these kinds of gray spaces of sustainability and of human development. And I've always, as a scholar, resisted being boxed in a particular label, right? I adopt a political economy approach, but I've never called myself a Marxist because I'm not one. I rather go with the term a critical pragmatist, right? I can be critical of capitalism, which I am in all my scholarship, but I'm not going to presuppose a view that I may have based on that predefined box that I may give myself. And I think this hopefully comes through in some of my scholarship, and I welcome kind of discussion on that. So to conclude, this is a short piece that I wrote in Dialogues in Human Geography on Henri Lefebvre's notion of autogestion or self-management, and linking this to the fourth P, that of politics, the political potential of informality. And the piece says, as scholars, we must build more ambitious research platforms that do justice to the informal processes that shape the central questions of our time. We must go beyond standalone thick description towards structural critique. From endogenous case studies to cross-scalar, relational, and theoretical analyses, and from the ivory tower to the ground of the everyday that forms part of our constitutive whole. The political study of informality holds great potential in this regard, especially if it builds on the radical premise that ordinary people everywhere hold the key to challenging repression and inequality. And I guess I'll just conclude with one last point. If I come across in my scholarship around informality as pushing kind of an urgent agenda, it's because I feel that urgency, right? I'm passionate about this scholarship because the urgency of 21st century urbanization and labor development and sustainable development is so closely tied to informality that I think the urgency of our scholarship needs to mirror that one-to-one. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the opportunity to present these really broad ideas, which are grounded hopefully sufficiently in the case studies. And I always welcome engagement and critique and discussion. So I'll say thank you and end it there.
Can you turn the camera on?
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for very interesting, fascinating, and critical presentation. And I have no doubt that there will be a lot of questions. So we are going to open it up for questioning. But I particularly enjoy your ability to connect theoretical issues with practical or case study situations across a number of African cities. So that is really well received. Question time, we have about 15 minutes for question. If you are online and you would like to ask a question, kindly use the raise hand button. Anyone in the room? Okay, Kim, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, thanks, Brandon, so much for that. It's a very provocative in many ways and interesting presentation with a lot to kind of engage with. I'm going to choose to engage just with one little piece of this, which is the way in which you frame the relations between formal and informal. Because as you say, there's long been a lot of, in a sense, a kind of furious agreement that the relations between informal and formal are not binary. But you characterize them as a dialectic, and you say that goes beyond non-binary thinking, right? But, you know, the dialectic, the idea of a dialectic has a history, and, you know, a legitimate and really interesting history too of, but it's a history where two relatively mutually exclusive concepts are seen as engaging with each other through a kind of historical dynamic. And that's a useful framework for a lot of understanding about how some of these things happen. But in relation to informal and formal, very often what we find are synergies and liaisons and hybrids and sometimes semi-stabilized arrangements that are working in different ways, either with different outcomes in terms of livelihoods, in terms of power, and all kinds of other things, and which to me don't seem like dialectic arrangements. I just wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair it's a fair point. That is, you know, in rendering kind of the dialectic, I'm saying that they may be distinct in some ways. So not only are they mutually co-constitutive, but that I can kind of separate them out, right? If I'm understanding that correctly. For me, they are mutually co-constitutive, right? They're not opposite. So I think in understanding this mutually co-constitutive relationship, we kind of see how the framework rejects that they are separate opposing systems, right? They're creating each other, but they also may borrow on each other in different ways. Now, I think even within informality, as you know from your work, we have informality from below, which I've mostly spent a lot of time kind of discussing in my presentation today, but also from above. Now, I'm obviously deeply sympathetic, however complicated informality is from below, but I'm very, very critical of informality from above, which can often be just the co-option of networks with the enabling factors of formal capital and political power through corruption or patronage networks itself. So I think we have distinctions within informality, but we also have, for me, this understanding of the mutually co-constitutive relationship between informality, that which is not formally regulated, registered, or protected by the state, kind of sometimes being used and instrumentalized by formal capital and by the state itself, but still kind of existing as something that is not the same as the formal economy, whether that's because of access to capital, whether it's because of the lack of registration and regulation itself. I still want to hold on to some distinctions, even though they are not mutually opposite to each other.
Okay. Are you okay with the response? Can we come back to
we
you?
can come back.
Yeah.
I mean, I could probably say more, right? For me, the dialectic is like overdetermined, right? To borrow the term from Hall, right? There's so many different things that are framing the dialectic itself, right? And this overdetermination is not isolated necessarily between just two forces. The contradiction reflects the conditions and existence of the kind of complex overarching structure. right? So for me, that structure can be global capitalism. It can be climate change that we're seeing with migration to Agbogloshi. But to call it a binary, I think misses the dialectical argument on that mutually co-constitutive nature.
Thank you. Any comment? Amanda, do you want to ask your? Or...
Yeah, just a quick comment of the conversation now, but I think to move beyond the binary framing of the situation, I also see similar coexistence in many locations in Indonesia, where informal urbanism, informal settlements, informal trading continue to operate, in such a large scale. But I think the key thing is, we need to be in terms of whether we need to qualify that mutual coexistence, because in a way that is an uneven codependence. People in informal contexts are so responsive, evolving, and while the formal sector is actually continue to ignore, and at the same time they rely on the resilience and the speed by which informal settlements or people who are operating in informal sectors morph itself. And I think just a quick comment that I think this geography of waste and importation of waste outside the global north into the global south post-colonial world, I think it's a very important research direction, because it challenged the way we conceptualize circularity in certain part of the world, ignoring those the circularity of waste, basically.
Thank you. I agree with your points, and I will add also that it's even more complex than the global north-south, right? We have importation from other African countries into Ghana too. We have from Ghana itself into Agbogloshi itself. We have expats in Europe necessarily bringing together e-waste to then ship it to Ghana. So it's on the one hand, I think, brings out the complication, but it also then, I think, ties the importance of flows of goods, right? The process of informality, which may appear in one specific site as a place-specific phenomenon, but I think is linked across these different places. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Kindly. Thanks.
Thank you, Finn, for your presentation. I have a very brief question because my research is related to your topic as well. I was thinking that we talk about the pollution halo and pollution heaven hypothesis. So you are talking about the planetary urbanization as well. So these global south countries, they are pollution heaven for these global supply chain, because all the e-waste dumped into those zones. So if we try to formalize these policies and these, the theories which I'm talking about, so if we try to make them pollution halo instead of pollution heaven, so would it not impact the neighborhoods or the communities which are spatially locked in and they are path dependent on these global supply chain? So if we formalize them, would it not hurt those informal economies of those communities?
I think it would. I agree with you. I think it would. And I think that points part of the contradictions and challenges of informal scholarship, but it also talks to the problem of formalization as, for me, oftentimes existing as a pseudo policy, right? You say, like, you can just formalize it. Maybe that can have some kind of benefits. I'm not opposed in all cases to formalization if we can show them demonstrably that it improves people's lives. I think in many cases it doesn't, principally because it cuts people out of their economic opportunities. But if we want to make that argument, and that is an argument that I make both for e-waste and for mining, we have to be honest about the harms as well, right? And that's why I'm talking so much about the toxicity, the occupational risks associated with ASM. It's because I'm very wary of romanticizing informality, and I won't do that in my scholarship or how I talk, but I also want to do justice to the people that are making what I think are very, very challenging but rational decisions to try to access that economic opportunity or the housing or kind of the different social networks that underpin that. So I don't kind of endorse like kind of a blanket formalization approach to e-waste or to mining, and kind of adopt a more governance middle ground, whether that's transformative cohabitation, whether that's supported self-provisioning, which is fundamentally grounded in the understanding that we need to work with, not against, informality. I think if there's one thing to take away from my talk, I think it would probably be that, not only because the scale and scope of informality, but because of the complexity of choices that people make through informality to get by on the everyday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe last question.
Okay, great. Brandon, thank you so much. That was excellent, and I really enjoyed the provocation. I wanted to pick up one of your final points around the call for new governance models. We see this a lot in urban studies and geography and planning, always a call for something new without clarity around what that newness could look like based on what we know of the systems today. So thinking about informality, informal infrastructuring and restructuring, you talked a lot about sort of informality from below, and you mentioned a little bit about informality from above. So thinking about governance and government, and you did mention corruption as well. I'm really kind of struck by your use of the word pathologization of those who are marginalized in the system, somehow being wrong. I think a lot about structural gaslighting and the work that I'm doing at the moment. And in thinking about how government is always, or governance is always looking to restructure and find new ways to consolidate its power and to continue that work of pathologizing marginalized communities. So in thinking through this idea of new governance, are you talking about different ways of doing kind of bottom-up sort of self-organization and governance from below, or are you like reimagining and reconsidering the way in which state processes might do that in the way that they don't look to, you know, backdoor informal deal making that we know is often the case, but often really hard to point out and name because they're so good at presenting the formal as good and just, and we know otherwise things are happening behind the scenes presenting. Consolidating.
That's awesome question. I'd love to read about structural gaslighting. That's a really cool term, and I'd like to know more about it. I think, and I've done some work with Patrick on this, where we actually call for both bottom up and top down intervention at the same time. And I think, I guess in public health they may call this like the diagonal approach, but I won't get into that now. But the bottom up is it's the supported self-provisioning that I'm talking about. It's working with the community groups that often can identify the problem better than anyone else, right? Because they live there, they understand the challenges that they face, and there's a lot of organization associated with informal actors themselves. The top down necessarily understands that because of the dialectical relationship that I'm really kind of trying to develop, that you do need structural support to help people actually attain upward mobility long term. I do work with agency, right? Provisional agency. For me, it's provisional. It's people exercising agency within constraint. And that constraint exists because of a lack of support, right? Of kind of formal infrastructure too. And so I don't want to only rely on bottom-up interventions, although it's obviously necessary to more equitable outcomes for informality. But I also need to ask the state or the city or even private capital to try to work not only with the bottom-up interventions, but to inject capital and infrastructure to actually support the long-term development and generative possibilities associated with informality and informal settlements. So when it comes to like the governance interventions itself and the pathologization, this comes from my work on artisanal and small-scale mining, where you see, and I mentioned very briefly around the colonial history of King Leopold II and Belgium in the Congo, but you actually see the active creation of informal groups where people are brought in for labor, but then that labor kind of dries up, where people are kind of stripped away from their communities, whether that's through eviction, whether that's the lack of payment of royalties from industrial companies, which then create that rational decision of using informality or informal means of mining to access a future and a livelihood for themselves. So that's the dialectical relationship where they're actively created. And then when that's not convenient for the state or the industrial mining companies, they then point at the artisanal miners and say, that's the problem with the supply chain, right? That's the dirty part of the supply chain that we need to get rid of, that we need to deploy the army for, to evict or to get away, so that we can have clean supply chains. Meanwhile, when we look at informality in this much broader kind of planetary sense, we get to understand that these structural drivers are so much more complicated because that dialectical relationship creates that precarity in the first place. So it's not to romanticize the very extremely challenging and harmful components of artisanal mining or informal e-waste recycling, but it's trying to understand not only that they exist, but why they exist. And when we can understand why they exist, I think we start to get to that kind of governance middle ground. But I take your point on the kind of the end of a lot of urban geography saying we need new governance. And, you know, that's part of ongoing work, something that I haven't like developed enough in my mind. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan. And all too soon, we just have to come to the end of today's talk. And how many questions will be left unanswered? Brendan is very happy to receive any emails or chats on LinkedIn, and also through his Informal Urbanism Sustainability Lab. So please do reach out to him if you need to have a bit of chat or open to collaboration. But on behalf of other Informal Urbanism Hub here in Melbourne, we'd like to say a big thank you to you, Brendan, for waking up at this time. I think it is getting close to midnight in where you are, to have a chat with us. We really appreciate that. And we hope to connect with you in the coming years or weeks or months ahead. And thanks everyone for coming in today, for participating and also engaging with the talk today. Thank you.
And thank you all for being here, whether it's in person there. It looks like a really cool room for a seminar, and online. Thank you, Patrick, for chairing this. Thank you, Kim, for initially inviting me to this following our engagement over the paper. I really appreciate that so much, and thanks for everyone that organized it. I really am happy to have shared my thoughts on my work with you, and would love to keep the conversation going.
Thank you. Thank you.
But now I probably need to sleep. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
That's great.
Yeah, he's doing some interesting work.
Yeah. Okay. That was fun. There's a thing, would you like to